For more than a decade, the Russian government, Putin, have persecuted, poisoned, and imprisoned Alexei Navalny. And now, the reports of his death.
Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition leader, died in prison on Friday, according to Russian prison authorities. The death has sent shockwaves through Russia's political orbit, as its president, Vladimir Putin, is seeking another election for another 6 years in power. Joining me now with the latest reaction is The Hill's Julia Manchester. Julia, thanks for joining us. What's been the global reaction on this?
Look, Kevin, I think the global reaction is certainly one of concern. This comes at a time when the Ukrainian military is really struggling in its battle against Russia, not getting what it says isn't enough of aid from Western countries like the U.S. So I think this is very much Putin really, flexing his political muscles. This obviously is, one of the more recent deaths, allegedly on his watch, or, of one of his political opponents. We know that Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed last year in August, months after he launched that coup against, tried to launch a coup against the Russian government. So, there's that perspective. But I also think this shows sort of where Putin's head is at. And obviously, none of us are inside of his head. However, Alexei Navalny was in a penal colony close to the Arctic Circle. He was able to communicate with his followers, which I think definitely is a sign of strength. But at the same time, there was this question of how effective would he be as a resistance leader? So I think there's also this feeling that this shows that Putin is increasingly paranoid.
Well, and to be according to the Russian authorities, Alexei Navalny died while taking an Arctic walk in this in this prison where the conditions are horrible. And so for this news to break just weeks before Putin is set to, I guess you could call it an election, but he's up for election for another 6 years in power. Does it show him weakened, Julia? Does it show that he's nervous that the head of the opposition is now dead just a couple of weeks before an election?
That's a good question. I think you could definitely look at it from the perspective that he is nervous because, like I said, Alexei Navalny was still able to communicate with his followers and he still was sending messages. His movement is still very much alive and well and, backed by many Western countries. I don't think it's much of a threat to Vladimir Putin's re-election bid. However, Navalny was tapping into this, frustration among Russian people, this frustration among those Russian people with the Kremlin and with the oligarchy in Russia. Remember, Navalny uncovered what is allegedly what he called Putin's palace, this large castle-like, building on the Black Sea, and it kind of showed Russians how leadership is living while the everyday Russian appears to be struggling. So, I think there is that threat from that regard. But at the same time, I think what you're seeing, from an international perspective, is Putin trying to posture himself as this strong man. He's obviously known as a strong man, but with Prigozhin, with Navalny now dead, I think he's also sending a signal to the West that he is unopposed. So I think you can look at it from the domestic Russian perspective, but also from the international one.
Well, I mean, he's also taken Russia into what some are saying a conflict that could last several more years. Tens of thousands, by some estimates even more than that, of Russians have lost their lives as a result of Putin taking Russia into war against Ukraine. Yesterday or earlier this week, the Ukrainian government saying that they were able to sink a major Russia tanker, another sign of momentum on the side of the Ukrainian army. It also comes at a time, though, in which here in Washington, D.C., the foreign aid package for aid and assistance to Ukraine, as well as Israel and Taiwan, its future is uncertain. What's the latest on that? It got out of the Senate. McConnell was able to get the win. We learned that in Bolton's exclusive interview with McConnell earlier this week. What's Speaker Johnson going to do?
Well, look, I mean, we'll have to see what Speaker Johnson is going to do because he's obviously in a very tough position as a Republican. It's so ironic because the Republican Party was, years ago was not the party of isolationism. It was the party of, supporting or going against Russia, supporting that resistance against Russia, giving aid to countries like Israel. But this issue of Ukraine in particular, this issue of Russia versus Ukraine, hearing some Republican senators talk about this war, it's, fascinating to listen to them. And it sort of paints this picture of the deep divide within the GOP on this issue. I mean, earlier this week, we heard Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson essentially predict, he was talking about how he thinks Putin is going to win the war. So there's a real divide, within the party. And I think that's really going to play out in the House in terms of Russia versus Ukraine. It also comes at a time when you see Trump, someone who in many ways is likely going to be the Republican nominee for president. He's stepping up his rhetoric against NATO countries and, in what was seen as sort of a, wink and a nudge maybe towards Putin. We don't know that for sure. However, you're going to see Trump probably influencing this as well. He's been able to, influence Republican lawmakers in the past. So I imagine he's getting involved in this as well.
Julia, let's talk about Trump. Let's stay with Trump for a minute, because earlier this week he went to court in New York City with Stormy Daniels. Of course, that's the hush money Stormy Daniels porn star payment. Remember, folks, from a couple of years ago. What happened with Stormy Daniels and Trump earlier in the New York court?
So Trump has been trying to get this case thrown out. His lawyers are saying this is election interference because it's happening during an election year. However, the judge in that case, Juan Merchan, essentially threw out that argument and said jury selection is set to begin on March 25th. So theoretically, there could be a verdict in this criminal case against the former president before the Republican National Convention. Now, politically, there could be some impacts on the election. We know that Trump's base seems to stay with him through thick and thin. In fact, there could be some evidence that shows that a conviction could help Trump with his own immediate base. However, there was an NBC poll released last week that showed Trump leading Biden by roughly 5 points. However, when those same voters were said, okay, if the former president were convicted of a crime, which way do you swing?
But see, I'm going to interrupt. I got it. Go ahead. Go finish the thought. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. So when asked that, voters said, Biden was leading by 2 points. So it sort of flips it.
But see, I think voters, and this is what Trump world's thinking, by the way, the sources in the Trump orbit, what they say is, but not necessarily each of the cases, the voters don't rank the cases the same, especially independent voters. And the Stormy Daniels case, like it or lump it, folks, according to all the data that the Trump world folks are looking at amongst independent voters, is the weakest case. January 6th, different storyline. What's happening down there in Fulton County, Georgia, which I want to get to next, different storyline. But Stormy Daniels, for whatever reason, this is something that the public just has not latched onto. So I take those polls of a conviction with a giant grain of salt because each of the cases are so different. Speaking of what's happening down there with the Fulton County District Attorney, wow. I mean, it was, I can't believe, almost, to be blunt, the lack of judgment on behalf of Fani Willis, the Fulton County District Attorney, the lack of judgment, rather, that she's having an affair with the prosecutor. What were your takeaways?
Well, it's quite a day in court yesterday watching that. And
it was like a soap opera, like a Shonda Rhimes soap opera.
And seeing her herself take the stand to defend herself, she's very much, pushing this line of, I'm not the one on trial. This is a distraction. So, we'll see how that plays. But look, if it is found that there was, in fact, this lack of judgment, and, she had that former friend, I should say, that testified yesterday and said, no, this relationship began in 2019, years before this investigation into Trump began, that's going to lead to some real problems. I mean, she could be removed from the case. That throws the case into question. But, it just shows how high stakes this case is. I mean, Kevin, you're absolutely right. Going back to the New York case, most legal experts and Republicans I talk to, and even Democrats, have said that New York case just doesn't hold up the same way that these other cases do. That's why Georgia the stakes are so incredibly high, because I think there's a lot of people who would argue that Willis does have a strong case. That's why this, pushback against her, these allegations that, this relationship took place and she was influenced by it. That's why this is also important.
Well, and it's also money, right? I mean, listen, I don't care what people do in their personal life, no concern to me. But with the money and the taxpayer funds that Fani Willis, the district attorney, hiring him, that's where it gets dicey. You got to follow the money. The same way that the Democrats are doing it to Trump, follow the money, is exactly the same thing that they're doing down there in Georgia. Follow the money. What was the money? What were the Georgia taxpayer money being used to pay for that relationship, quite honestly? In Georgia, we all know the history of the politicians down there on both sides of the aisle who have had scandals. Julia Manchester, no one does it better, folks. Julia Manchester, go click on it. What America is thinking. Her and her team do an excellent job. Julia, thank you so much for making the time for us to break down a very, very, very busy day in news.
Thanks, Kevin. Good to be with you.
Of course. And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.